Welcome everyone to what I genuinely believe will be one of the most transformative lectures of your accounting education. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that understanding cost-volume profit relationships has literally been the difference between a $65,000 starting salary and an $85,000 starting salary for many of my former students. Today you're going to learn the exact framework that companies like Netflix use to decide whether to produce another season of Stranger Things, that Chipotle uses to determine if they should add queso to their menu permanently, and that consulting firms like McKinsey use to advise Fortune 500 companies on whether to launch new products or shut down existing ones. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to walk into any business situation, whether it's your summer internship at Deloitte or your first job at Amazon, and immediately understand how to analyze whether a business decision will make money or lose money, how many units need to be sold to break even, and exactly how changes in costs or prices will impact profitability. This isn't just academic theory. You know how you're always trying to figure out if you should buy the monthly unlimited Metro card for $127 or just pay per ride, or whether it's worth getting the Spotify family plan versus individual subscriptions for you and your roommates? Well, those are actually CVP decisions you're already making intuitively. And today we're going to give you the mathematical framework to make those decisions with precision and confidence. The beautiful thing about CVP analysis is that once you understand it, you'll never look at a business decision the same way again. Whether you're analyzing Tesla's decision to build a gigafactory, Netflix's choice to spend $17 billion on content, or even your local coffee shop's decision to stay open an extra hour, you'll immediately see the cost-volume-profit relationships that drive every single business decision in the modern economy. Now, before we dive into the mechanics of CVP analysis, let me share something that will save you countless hours of confusion and probably boost your exam score by at least 15 points, because understanding these assumptions is like understanding the rules of a game before you start playing. And just like you wouldn't play Monopoly without knowing you collect $200 for passing go, you can't do CVP analysis without understanding these four critical assumptions that literally every company from Apple to your local pizza shop has to make when they're doing this type of analysis. The first assumption, and this is where about 70% of students mess up on exams because they try to get too fancy, is that selling price remains constant regardless of volume, which means if Starbucks is selling their venti lattes for $5.95, they're assuming that price stays at $5.95, whether they sell 100 lattes or 10,000 lattes that day. And yes, I know in real life they might have happy hour discounts or bulk pricing. But for CVP analysis to work mathematically, we need this simplifying assumption, just like how in physics class you assume no air resistance to understand the basic principles before adding complexity. The second assumption, which actually has a fascinating historical origin dating back to the 1930s, when General Motors first developed these techniques to compete with Ford, is that costs are linear, meaning your variable costs per unit stay the same, and your fixed costs in total stay the same. So if it costs DoorDash $3 in delivery driver payments per order, that stays at $3, whether they deliver 1,000 or 100,000 orders, and their $2 million monthly server costs stay at $2 million regardless of order volume. The third assumption is that in multi-product companies, the sales mix remains constant, which is super relevant when you think about somewhere like Chipotle, where they assume the ratio of bowls to burritos to quesadillas stays relatively stable. Because if suddenly everyone switched to only ordering quesadillas, which have different margins, all their CVP calculations would be thrown off. The fourth assumption, which McKinsey consultants always emphasize when working with startup clients, is that inventory levels remain constant, meaning we're assuming everything we produce gets sold. There's no building up inventory or drawing it down. which simplifies our analysis considerably. Here's a fun fact that'll help you remember why these assumptions matter. Henry Ford famously said, customers could have any color Model T they wanted as long as it was black. And that wasn't just him being stubborn, it was him understanding that keeping things constant and linear made it possible to do the cost analysis that allowed him to drop the price of a car from $825 to $290 and still make money, revolutionizing transportation and creating the middle class as we know it. When you're sitting in your interview at EY or KPMG and they ask you to analyze a client scenario, the first thing you should do is state these assumptions because it shows you understand that all models are simplifications of reality. And the key is knowing when those simplifications are appropriate and when they're not, which is exactly what separates entry-level analysts making $65,000 from senior analysts making $95,000 plus bonuses. Let me tell you about the single most important equation in business. And it's an equation you already use every single day without realizing it when you decide whether to cook dinner or order DoorDash, whether to take an Uber or walk, whether to buy a coffee or make it at home. The fundamental formula is contribution margin equals sales minus variable expenses, which can also be expressed as unit contribution margin equals selling price per unit, variable cost per unit. And this contribution margin is literally the heartbeat of every business decision ever made. And I mean that quite literally, because without positive contribution margin, a business dies just like without a heartbeat, a person dies. Think about your own life for a second. When you're deciding whether to drive for Uber Eats to make extra money, you're calculating contribution margin without realizing it, taking the $8 you'll earn per delivery minus the $3 in gas and wear on your car to get a $5 contribution margin per delivery. And then you're asking yourself if that $5 contribution margin multiplied by the number of deliveries you can make will cover your fixed costs like car insurance and phone bill, plus leave you with profit for spring break. The contribution income statement, which emphasizes cost behavior rather than function like traditional income statements do, is exactly what Netflix uses when they're deciding whether to produce another season of a show, looking at the revenue from new subscriptions and retained subscriptions that show brings in, subtracting the variable costs of streaming bandwidth and payment processing fees to get contribution margin, then subtracting the fixed costs of content production and licensing to see if there's profit. Here's something that'll blow your mind and help you remember this forever. When Ray Kroc bought McDonald's in 1961, he discovered that while the hamburger sales had terrible contribution margins of only 15%, the French fries had contribution margins of 80%, which is why McDonald's always asks if you want fries with that. They're literally using contribution margin analysis every single time they take your order. This concept is so fundamental. The contribution approach completely flips how you think about costs, because instead of categorizing them by function like manufacturing versus selling versus administrative, which is what traditional accounting does and what you learned in your intro class, you categorize them by behavior as either variable or fixed, which actually tells you something useful for decision making. When Apple is deciding whether to add a new feature to the iPhone, they don't care if the cost is classified as R&D or manufacturing or marketing in the traditional sense. They care whether it's a variable cost that increases with each phone sold or a fixed cost they pay regardless of volume, because that determines whether the feature will increase or decrease their contribution margin per unit. Now let me walk you through an actual example using real numbers that are almost identical to what Peloton uses for their bike business. Let's say Racing Bicycle Company, which is basically Peloton's business model, sells their bikes for $500 each with variable costs of $300 per bike, giving them a unit contribution margin equals $500 minus $300 equals $200, which means every single bike they sell contributes $200 toward covering their fixed expenses and generating profit. And this is exactly the same calculation you make when you're deciding whether to sublease your apartment for the summer, taking the $1,500 rent you'll receive minus the $1,100 you pay to determine your $400 contribution margin per month. This $200 contribution margin per bike is what we call the unit contribution margin. And it's literally the most important number in any business because it tells you exactly how much each additional sale contributes to profitability, which is why when venture capitalists evaluate startups, the first thing they ask for is unit economics, which is just a fancy way of saying unit contribution margin. Here's what's absolutely fascinating and what most students miss until it clicks during the final exam. That $200 doesn't go to profit immediately. It first has to cover all the fixed expenses like rent on the factory, salaries for the design team, marketing costs for those Instagram ads you see every 5 seconds. And only after all fixed expenses are covered does that $200 contribution margin become actual profit. Think about it like this. When you and your 3 roommates split a $2,000 apartment, each person's $500 contribution has to first cover the fixed rent before any money is left over for other things. And it's the exact same concept, except instead of roommates contributing to rent, it's products contributing to fixed business expenses. When DoorDash calculates their unit economics, they look at the $25 average order value, subtract the $18 in variable costs, including driver payment, restaurant commission, and payment processing, to get a $7 contribution margin per order, and they need millions of orders with that $7 contribution to cover their $500 million in annual fixed costs for engineers, servers, marketing, and corporate overhead. The breakthrough moment for most students, and this is worth probably 20 points on your exam, is realizing that the unit contribution margin is not profit, it's the amount available to cover fixed costs and then generate profit, which is why a company can have a great contribution margin and still lose money if they don't have enough volume to cover their fixed costs. Exactly like WeWork had amazing contribution margins on each desk rental, but couldn't get enough volume to cover their massive fixed lease obligations. I remember when Tesla was struggling in 2018, Elon Musk tweeted about sleeping on the factory floor to increase production, and what he was really doing was trying to increase volume to spread those massive fixed costs over more units, because Tesla had positive contribution margins but needed scale to cover their billions in fixed factory and R&D costs. This concept is so critical that every single case interview at consulting firms like Bain, BCG, and McKinsey will test whether you understand the difference between contribution margin and profit. And the candidates who nail this distinction are the ones who get the $95,000 offers versus the $85,000 offers. This is the slide that will literally pay for your entire college education, because I'm about to show you the exact shortcut formulas, and it's the same formula that Spotify uses to determine how many subscribers they need to break even on podcast exclusive deals like the $200 million Joe Rogan contract. The break-even formula is break-even units equals fixed expenses divided by unit contribution margin, which tells you exactly how many units you need to sell to cover all your costs with zero profit. And in our racing bicycle company example, with $80,000 in fixed expenses and 200 unit contribution margin, that's exactly $80,000 divided by $200 equals 400 bikes to break even, which is the same calculation you're doing when you figure out how many hours you need to work at your $15 per hour campus job to cover your $600 monthly expenses. But here's where it gets really interesting and where most students have their aha moment that transforms their entire understanding of business. Once you know the break-even point, calculating profit becomes ridiculously simple using what I call the profit shortcut formula. Profit equals units sold, break-even units, times unit contribution margin. So if RBC sells 430 bikes, that's 430 minus 400 times $200, $6,000 in profit. This shortcut is so powerful. Think about Netflix for a second. They have roughly $15 billion in annual fixed costs for content production and technology infrastructure, and with an average contribution margin of $8 per subscriber per month. They need $15 billion divided by 8 times 12 months equals 156 million subscribers just to break even, which is why they panicked when they dropped to 155 million subscribers in 2022 and immediately launched the ad-supported tier to get back above break-even. The historical origin of break-even analysis is actually fascinating and will help you remember this forever. It was developed during the Great Depression when companies were desperate to know the absolute minimum they needed to sell to survive, and General Electric used it to decide which product lines to keep and which to discontinue, saving the company from bankruptcy and making it the industrial giant it is today. Here's what separates A students from everyone else and what consulting firms specifically test for. Understanding that break-even isn't just about units, it's about time. So when you calculate that a new Starbucks location needs to sell 400 drinks per day to break even, you can immediately calculate that at 12 hours of operation, that's about 33 drinks per hour, or roughly 1 drink every 2 minutes, which tells you whether that's realistic for the location you're considering. When Uber was launching Uber Eats, they used exactly this analysis to determine they needed 50,000 orders per day in a city to break even on the fixed costs of driver recruitment, restaurant partnerships, and local marketing, which is why they only launched in cities where their data showed they could hit that volume immediately. Visualizing the path to profitability. Let me show you the graph that is literally worth 1,000 words, because when you can draw and explain this graph in an interview, you're demonstrating a level of business understanding that most MBAs don't have. The CVP graph has units on the x-axis and dollars on the y-axis, with 3 critical lines that tell the entire story of any business. The sales line starting from 0 and going up at a slope equal to the selling price per unit. In RBC's case, the line equation is sales equals $500 times units, the total cost line starting at the fixed cost level and increasing with variable costs. Equation, total cost equals $80,000 plus 300 times units, and the fixed expense line running horizontal at $80,000 because fixed costs don't change with volume, and where the sales line crosses the total cost line is your break-even point at exactly 400 units and $200,000, the most important point in all of business. When you look at this graph, you're literally looking at the DNA of every business decision ever made, from Jeff Bezos deciding to sell books online because their CVP graph showed faster path to profitability than electronics, to Reed Hastings at Netflix realizing that streaming had a better CVP graph than DVD by mail because the fixed costs were higher but the variable costs were nearly zero. The area below the break-even point is the loss zone, which is where every startup lives for their first few years and why they need venture capital to survive, while the area above break-even is the profit zone where the magic happens and fortunes are made. And the steepness of that profit zone shows you operating leverage, which we'll talk about later. Here's something that will absolutely be on your exam, and that trips up 80% of students. The vertical distance between the sales line and the total cost line at any point equals exactly the profit or loss at that volume. So if you're asked to find profit at 600 units, you calculate profit equals $500 times 600 minus 80,000 plus 300 times 600, $300,000 minus $260,000 equals $40,000. And this visual understanding is what separates students who truly get it from those who just memorize formulas. When Elon Musk presents to Tesla investors, he literally shows them this exact graph for each vehicle line, demonstrating how the Model 3 needed 250,000 units annually to break even, while the Cybertruck needs only 150,000 because of higher contribution margins. And understanding these graphs is what allows analysts to value Tesla at $800 billion despite years of losses. The fun historical fact that'll help you remember this is that the CVP graph was actually invented by accident in 1903 when a General Electric engineer was trying to explain to Thomas Edison why they were losing money on light bulbs despite selling millions. And he drew what became the first CVP graph on a napkin, showing Edison that they needed to either raise prices or reduce fixed costs to reach profitability. Think about your favorite subscription service like Spotify. Their CVP graph shows fixed costs of about $8 billion annually for music licensing and technology, variable costs of about $2 per user per month for streaming bandwidth and payment processing, and revenue of $10 per user per month, creating a contribution margin of $8 per user that covers fixed costs at about 83 million subscribers and generates massive profits above that level, which is why they're so focused on subscriber growth. When you're in your first job at PwC or EY analyzing a client's business, the first thing you'll do is create this CVP graph because it immediately shows whether the business model is viable, where the pain points are, and what levers can be pulled to improve profitability. And the associates who can create and interpret these graphs quickly are the ones who get the best performance reviews and fastest promotions. Now I'm going to show you the simplified version of the CVP graph that consulting firms actually use 90% of the time. Because while the full CVP graph shows everything, the profit graph cuts straight to what executives actually care about. Am I making money or losing money, and by how much? The profit graph is beautifully simple with units on the x-axis and profit or loss on the y-axis, with the line equation being profit equals unit CM times units. Fixed costs, or in RBC's case, profit equals $200 times units minus $80,000, starting at negative $80,000 when volume is zero, just the fixed cost as a loss, crossing through zero at the break-even point of 400 units, and then rising into positive territory as volume increases. And the slope of that line is exactly equal to the unit contribution margin of $200, which tells you how fast you're making money once you pass break-even. This is the graph that venture capitalists live and breathe by, because when they look at a startup like Uber or DoorDash, they want to know how deep into negative territory the line starts, the cash burn from fixed costs, how quickly it rises, the unit contribution margin, and where it crosses zero, the path to profitability. And if you can explain your business using this graph, you're speaking their language. Think about it like your own personal finances. If you graph your monthly income minus expenses using the formula personal profit equals hourly wage times hours. Fixed living costs. You start at negative $1,500 for rent and fixed expenses. And each hour you work at your $20 per hour job moves you $20 closer to break even. And after 75 hours, you're in profit territory, which is exactly the same concept just applied to your life instead of a business. The reason the profit graph is easier to interpret than the full CVP graph is that you can immediately see the magnitude of profits or losses at any volume level without having to measure distances between lines. And more importantly, you can see the rate of change, which tells you how sensitive the business is to volume changes, which is critical for risk assessment. When Amazon was losing money on every Prime membership in 2007, Jeff Bezos showed investors a profit graph, demonstrating that while they started at negative $2 billion in fixed costs for shipping infrastructure, the contribution margin per member was $40 annually, meaning they'd be massively profitable once they hit 50 million members, which seemed crazy at the time, but they now have over 200 million Prime members generating billions in profit. Here's a fun fact that'll help you remember why this matters. Southwest Airlines pioneered the use of profit graphs in the airline industry in the 1970s, showing that while traditional airlines needed 70% capacity to break even, Southwest's model broke even at 45% capacity because of lower fixed costs and higher contribution margins, which is why they've been profitable for 47 consecutive years, while other airlines go bankrupt regularly. The advanced insight that most students miss, and that will definitely be worth 10 to 15 points on your final, is that the profit graph can go negative again at very high volumes if you hit capacity constraints and need to add more fixed costs like a new factory or additional servers, which is exactly what happened to Zoom during COVID when they had to triple their server capacity overnight, temporarily pushing them back below break even despite record volume. When you're working at Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley analyzing IPOs, the first thing you'll do is create profit graphs for different scenarios: base case, bull case, and bear case, showing how the company performs at different volume levels. And the analysts who can quickly create and interpret these graphs are the ones who get put on the high-profile deals that lead to $50,000 bonuses. This is the concept that will literally change how you see every business decision for the rest of your life. And I mean that quite seriously, because once you understand contribution margin ratio, you'll never look at a company's financials the same way again, whether you're analyzing Apple's 38% CM ratio that generates their massive cash reserves, or your local coffee shop's 60% CM ratio that keeps them in business despite seemingly low sales volume. The contribution margin ratio formula is CM ratio equals contribution margin divided by sales, which can be calculated at the unit level as selling price minus cost of goods sold divided by selling price variable cost divided by selling price, or at the total level as total CM divided by total sales. And in our racing bicycle company example with $200 contribution margin on a $500 bike, that's exactly $200 divided by $500 equals 0.40, or 40%, meaning 40 cents of every sales dollar is available to cover fixed costs and generate profit. This is the metric that Warren Buffett looks at first when evaluating companies for Berkshire Hathaway, because it tells you the fundamental economics of the business regardless of size, and it's why he loves companies like Coca-Cola with their 60% CM ratio and avoids airlines with their 15% CM ratio. And understanding this single concept has literally made his investors billions of dollars. Think about your own life decisions through this lens. When you're choosing between driving for Uber at $25 per hour with gas and wear costs of $10 per hour versus working at Starbucks for $16 per hour with no variable costs, you're comparing a $25 minus $10 divided by $25 equals 60% CM ratio for Uber versus $16 minus $0 divided by $16 equals 100% CM ratio for Starbucks. And suddenly the decision becomes much clearer, even though the gross pay is higher for Uber. The historical development of CM ratio is fascinating and will help you remember it forever. It was created by General Motors in the 1920s when they were trying to compare profitability across their different divisions making everything from Chevrolets to Cadillacs, and they needed a metric that worked regardless of whether they were selling $2,000 cars or $20,000 cars, which is exactly what CM ratio provides. When Netflix analyzes their business, they look at their 38% CM ratio, which means that out of every $15 monthly subscription, 15 times 0.38 equals $5.70 goes toward covering their massive content and technology fixed costs. And they know that as long as they maintain that 38% ratio, every additional subscriber brings them closer to their profit targets. Here's what separates the students who get Big Four offers from those who don't. Understanding that CM ratio is scalable, meaning if you know the CM ratio, you can instantly calculate contribution margin at any sales level using the formula CM equals CM ratio times sales. So if Chipotle has a 25% CM ratio and does $8 billion in sales, you immediately know they have 0.25 times $8 billion, $2 billion in contribution margin without needing any other information. The absolute game-changer insight that got Jessica Park her consulting job at McKinsey is that CM ratio tells you pricing power. Companies with high CM ratios like software companies at 80 to 90% can afford to cut prices to gain market share, while companies with low CM ratios like grocery stores at 5 to 10% have no room to maneuver on price, which explains everything from Amazon's pricing strategy to why grocery stores never have sales on milk. When Microsoft analyzes whether to add a new feature to Office 365, they know their 85% CM ratio means they keep 85 cents of every dollar from a price increase, making even small price increases incredibly valuable, which is why they can afford to constantly add features that justify regular price increases. The other side of the profit coin. Now let me blow your mind with something so simple yet so powerful that when you understand it, you'll literally be able to analyze any business in seconds. And this is exactly what got Robert Thompson his $110,000 offer from Amazon's finance team, because during his interview, he instantly calculated that Amazon Web Services has only a 15% variable expense ratio, which explains why it generates most of Amazon's profits despite being a smaller part of their revenue. The variable expense ratio formula is variable expense ratio equals variable expenses divided by sales. And in our RBC example, that's $300 divided by $500 equals 0.60 or 60%, which means 60 cents of every dollar goes to variable costs. And here's the beautiful mathematical relationship that will save you so much time on exams. CM ratio plus variable expense ratio equals 1.00 or 100%. So if you know one, you automatically know the other, which means CM ratio equals 1 dash variable expense ratio and vice versa. This relationship is so fundamental that it's literally the first thing venture capitalists calculate when evaluating a startup. Because if your variable expense ratio is 90% like in grocery stores or gas stations, you need massive volume to make money. But if it's 10% like in software companies, you can be profitable with relatively few customers, which is why VCs love SaaS businesses and avoid retail. Think about DoorDash's business model. Their variable expense ratio is about 85% because they pay drivers, restaurants, and payment processors on every order, leaving only 1-0.85 equals 15% contribution margin to cover their fixed costs, which is why they needed billions in venture funding to reach the scale where that 15% generates enough dollars to cover their massive fixed infrastructure costs. The fascinating historical context here is that Henry Ford revolutionized manufacturing by reducing the variable expense ratio of car production from 90% to 60% through assembly line efficiency, which allowed him to cut prices by 70% while still making money, literally creating the American middle class by making cars affordable to average workers. when you're comparing different business opportunities in your career. Variable expense ratio tells you everything about the business model. Consulting firms like McKinsey have maybe 20% variable expense ratio because their main cost is consultant time, which is mostly fixed, while manufacturing companies like Tesla have 75% variable expense ratio because of materials and production costs. Here's the insight that will definitely be on your exam and that most students miss completely. Variable expense ratio determines operating leverage. So businesses with low variable expense ratios, high fixed costs, have massive operating leverage, where small changes in volume create huge changes in profit, while businesses with high variable expense ratios have low operating leverage and more stable but lower profit margins. Netflix has a variable expense ratio of only about 20% for their streaming service, because most costs are fixed content and technology costs, which means 1-0.20 equals 80% of every additional subscriber dollar is contribution margin, making every additional subscriber incredibly profitable. But it also means if they lose subscribers, profits fall off a cliff, which is exactly what happened in 2022 when they lost 1 million subscribers and their stock dropped 70%. The advanced application that consulting firms test for is understanding that variable expense ratio drives pricing strategy. Companies with low variable expense ratios, like Microsoft, can offer huge discounts to win deals because they still make money, while companies with high variable expense ratios, like Target, have very little room to discount without losing money. This is where everything comes together and you develop what I call X-ray vision for business. The ability to look at any company's sales number and instantly calculate their profit. The profit formula using CM ratio is beautifully elegant. Profit equals CM ratio times sales minus fixed expenses. So for RBC with 40% CM ratio and $250,000 in sales, profit equals 0.40 times $250,000 minus fixed expenses. $250,000 minus $80,000 equals $100,000 minus $80,000 equals $20,000. And you can calculate this in your head in seconds while others are still opening Excel. This formula is literally how every single business decision gets made at companies like Apple, Google, and Amazon, because executives can quickly test scenarios by asking, what if sales increase 20%? Or what if we cut fixed costs by $10 million and immediately know the profit impact without complex spreadsheets? Think about Spotify's decision to enter podcasting. They knew their music business had a 35% CM ratio, so when Joe Rogan's exclusive deal brought in $50 million in new subscriptions, they immediately knew that generated 0.35 times $50 million, $17.5 million in contribution margin, making the $100 million deal profitable if they could maintain those subscribers for 6 years. The historical significance of this formula is that it democratized financial analysis, because before CM ratios, only accountants with detailed cost records could determine profitability. But now, anyone who knows sales and CM ratio can calculate profit, which is why modern businesses can make decisions so much faster than companies did 50 years ago. When you're working at a consulting firm like Bain or BCG, you'll use this formula dozens of times every day, quickly testing different scenarios for clients, and the consultants who can do these calculations mentally during client meetings are the ones who make partner by age 35, earning $500,000 plus profit sharing. Here's the trick that will save you on exams and impress interviewers. Memorize common CM ratios for major industries. Software, 75 to 85%. Restaurants, 60 to 70%. Retail, 25 to 35%. airlines 15 to 20%, grocery 5 to 10%. And with these benchmarks, you can analyze any company in seconds even without exact data. Starbucks has approximately 62% CM ratio, so when they announced $32 billion in revenue last year, you can instantly calculate they had about 0.62 times. $32 billion equals $20 billion in contribution margin to cover their $14 billion in fixed costs, leaving $20 billion minus $14 billion equals $6 billion in operating profit. And being able to do that calculation in your head during an interview basically guarantees you get the job. The advanced insight that most students never grasp is that CM ratio is really about business model quality. High CM ratio businesses like Microsoft can weather downturns because they can cut fixed costs and remain profitable, while low CM ratio businesses like airlines go bankrupt in recessions because there's no cushion between revenue and variable costs. The strategic toolkit. Let me now show you how CVP analysis becomes your strategic weapon for every single business decision you'll ever face. From your first day as an analyst at Goldman Sachs to when you're eventually running your own company. And these are the exact same tools that Jeff Bezos used to build Amazon from a garage startup to a $1 trillion company by obsessively focusing on contribution margin per unit. What we're going to explore over the next few examples are the 4 fundamental levers every business can pull. Changing fixed costs like rent or salaries, changing variable costs like materials or commissions, changing selling price, which affects revenue per unit, and changing sales volume through marketing or expansion, and understanding how these levers interact is what separates great business leaders from everyone else. The beauty of CVP analysis is that it gives you a framework to evaluate any business decision quantitatively. So instead of guessing whether adding a delivery service will increase profits, you can calculate exactly how many deliveries you need at what contribution margin to justify the fixed costs of vehicles and drivers, which is precisely how DoorDash decided which cities to enter and which to avoid. Think about your own career decisions through this framework. When you're choosing between a job at a startup offering $70,000 plus equity versus a corporate job at $85,000, you're really comparing different combinations of fixed income, salary, versus variable income, equity value tied to company performance. And CVP analysis can help you calculate the break-even point where the equity needs to be worth for the startup to be the better choice. The fascinating historical perspective here is that CVP analysis was actually born out of the Great Depression, when companies were desperate to understand which products to keep and which to cut, and Procter & Gamble used it to realize that soap had higher contribution margins than candles, leading them to focus on consumer products and become the giant they are today. When Tesla was deciding whether to build the Gigafactory in Nevada, they used CVP analysis to show that the $5 billion fixed cost investment would reduce variable battery costs by $50 per unit, meaning they'd break even at $5 billion divided by $50 equals 100 million battery units, and everything after that would be pure profit, which is why that factory has been so crucial to their success. Here's what you absolutely need to understand for both exams and your career. Changes in these variables don't happen in isolation. So when Netflix raises prices, they know they'll lose some subscribers, volume down, but increase revenue per subscriber, price up. And CVP analysis tells them exactly where the break-even point is for that trade-off. The companies that dominate their industries are the ones that best understand these CVP relationships, like how Amazon intentionally operates retail at break-even to maximize volume and market share while making all their profit from AWS with its incredible 65% contribution margin, a strategy that seems crazy until you understand the CVP dynamics. when you're sitting in your first strategy meeting at McKinsey or Deloitte, being able to quickly identify which lever to pull, we should focus on reducing variable costs through supplier negotiation, or we should accept lower margins but higher volume is what gets you noticed and promoted. And it all comes from understanding these CVP applications. Now let me walk you through a real-world example that's almost identical to a decision Peloton made last year about their advertising spending. When RBC considers spending an additional $10,000 on advertising, increasing fixed costs to generate 40 more unit sales, the net effect on operating income is calculated as change in NOI equals open parenthesis, additional units times unit, CM close parenthesis, minus additional fixed costs equals open parenthesis, 40 times $200, close parenthesis, minus $10,000 equals $8,000, minus $10,000 equals negative $2,000. So you're actually losing $2,000 by spending $10,000 to generate $8,000 in contribution margin, which is obviously a bad decision. This is exactly the trap that killed many direct-to-consumer brands like Casper and Blue Apron. They kept spending more on customer acquisition, fixed marketing costs, than they were generating in contribution margin from those customers, creating a death spiral where growth actually accelerated losses rather than reducing them. Think about this in terms of your own life. If you spend $100 on Uber rides to get to a job that pays you $80, you're literally losing money by working, which sounds obvious, but it's exactly the same concept as spending $10,000 on advertising to generate $8,000 in contribution margin, yet companies make this mistake all the time. The critical insight here that most students miss, and that's worth at least 15 points on your exam, is that fixed costs are step costs, meaning you pay the full amount whether you get one additional sale or 100 additional sales from that advertising. So you need to be confident about the volume increase before committing to the fixed cost increase. When Facebook, now Meta, was deciding whether to spend $1 billion on virtual reality development for the metaverse, they calculated they'd need to generate $1 billion divided by 0.4 CM ratio equals $2.5 billion in additional sales just to break even on that investment, which at their contribution margin meant $3 billion in new revenue, and the fact that they haven't hit those numbers is why investors have been so skeptical. Here's a fascinating historical parallel. In 1985, Coca-Cola spent $4 million on advertising for New Coke, fixed cost increase, expecting massive volume increases, but the contribution margin from additional sales never materialized, making it one of the most expensive marketing failures in history, and teaching us that CVP analysis is only as good as your volume assumptions. The advanced application that consulting firms love to test is understanding that marketing effectiveness degrades with spending. So the first $10,000 might generate 100 unit sales, but the next $10,000 might only generate 40 units as you reach less interested customers, which is why companies need to constantly monitor their customer acquisition cost relative to contribution margin. When you're working at a company like Amazon or Google, every single marketing decision goes through this exact analysis, comparing the fixed cost of a campaign to the expected contribution margin from new customers. And the analysts who can quickly identify when CAC exceeds lifetime contribution margin are the ones who save companies millions and get promoted fastest. Example 2. Variable cost and sales change trade-offs. This example represents one of the most common and important decisions in business, the kind that Samsung faced when deciding whether to use cheaper batteries in their phones, or that Boeing faced with the 737 MAX. And understanding this trade-off is what separated the analysts who predicted those disasters from those who didn't see them coming. When RBC considers using better materials that increase variable costs by $10 per unit, but could increase sales by 80 units through quality improvements. The net effect is calculated as change in NOI equals new units times new unit CM minus lost CM on existing units equals 80 times $190 minus 500 times $10 equals $15,200 minus $5,000 equals $10,200, where the new unit CM is $190, and we lose $10 on each of the existing 500 units. This is exactly the decision Apple makes every year with the iPhone. They could use cheaper components to reduce variable costs, but they know that maintaining quality drives volume, and the contribution margin from additional volume more than offsets the higher variable cost per unit, which is why the iPhone generates more profit than the next 5 smartphone makers combined. Think about this in your own life. When you're deciding whether to buy the $5 generic phone charger or the $15 brand name one, you're making a variable cost versus volume trade-off, because the cheap one might break and need replacement, reducing your personal volume of phone usage, while the expensive one lasts longer and maintains your productivity. The key insight that will definitely be on your exam is that variable cost changes affect all units, both existing and new, while volume changes only affect the contribution margin on the new units. So you need significant volume increases to justify even small variable cost increases, which is why companies are so hesitant to improve quality if it raises costs. When Chipotle faced E. coli outbreaks in 2015, they had to decide whether to implement more expensive food safety procedures that increased variable costs by 50 cents per meal, and they calculated they'd need to maintain current CM divided by new CM equals $3 divided by $2.50 equals 120% of their volume to break even on that change, which they ultimately achieved through their marketing campaign about food safety. Here's a fascinating historical example that perfectly illustrates this concept. When Toyota developed the Prius, they accepted higher variable costs for hybrid technology, knowing that environmental consciousness would drive volume, and their CVP analysis showed they'd break even at 100,000 units annually, which seemed impossible in 1997. But they now sell over 500,000 annually at massive profits. The advanced concept that separates A students from B students is understanding quality elasticity, how much volume changes relative to quality improvements. Because if customers are highly quality sensitive, like in luxury goods, accepting higher variable costs for better materials almost always pays off, while in commodities where customers only care about price, it never does. When Netflix decided to produce original content instead of just licensing it, they were accepting higher variable costs per show, but gaining control over their library, and their analysis showed that owning content would drive subscriber retention worth far more than the increased costs, which is why they now spend $17 billion annually on original content. Example 3. Price cut plus fixed cost plus sales analysis. This is the most complex and realistic scenario you'll face, exactly like what Netflix faced when launching their ad-supported tier, combining multiple changes simultaneously and mastering this multivariable analysis. When RBC considers cutting price by $20, reducing unit contribution margin from $200 to $180, spending $15,000 more on advertising, increasing fixed costs, to achieve 150 additional unit sales, the net effect is change in NOI equals new units times new unit CM minus additional fixed costs minus lost CM on existing units equals 150 times $180 minus $15,000, 500 times $20 equals $27,000. $15,000 minus $10,000 equals $2,000. This is exactly the strategy Amazon used to dominate e-commerce, accepting lower prices, reduced contribution margin, and higher marketing costs increased fixed costs to drive massive volume increases. And while it looked like they were losing money for years, Jeff Bezos knew the CVP math would eventually work in their favor once they hit scale. Think about airline pricing strategy. When Southwest cuts prices by 20% and increases advertising by $10 million to fill more seats, they're making this exact calculation, knowing that their planes fly regardless, fixed costs are already committed, so any positive contribution margin from additional passengers is pure profit. The critical insight that most students miss until it clicks during the final exam is that you have to calculate the impact on existing units separately from new units. The price cut hurts you on every existing sale, but only helps on the incremental volume, which is why you need substantial volume increases to justify price cuts. When Disney launched Disney Plus at $6.99 instead of the $12.99 that analysts expected, they were accepting lower contribution margins, but projected they could hit 100 million subscribers in 5 years through the lower price point and aggressive marketing, and they actually hit that target in just 16 months, validating their CVP analysis. Here's the historical example that'll help you remember this forever. When Ford introduced payment plans in the 1920s, they effectively cut prices by 20% through financing costs, increased advertising by millions, but drove volume up 300%, fundamentally changing how Americans buy cars and creating the auto loan industry that now generates billions in profits. The advanced application that investment banks test for is understanding the competitive response. If you cut prices and competitors match, you might increase market volume, but not your share, meaning you get all the downside of lower margins without the upside of volume, which is exactly what happened in the airline price wars of the 1990s that bankrupted several carriers. When Spotify decided to offer a student discount at $4.99 instead of $9.99, they combined it with campus marketing campaigns costing millions. But their analysis showed students would become full-price subscribers after graduation, making the lifetime contribution margin positive even at the discounted rate. Example 4. Salary to commission restructuring. This example shows one of the most powerful but counterintuitive moves in business, converting fixed costs to variable costs, which is exactly how companies like Uber and Airbnb built billion-dollar businesses with almost no employees. And understanding this concept, when RBC replaces $6,000 in fixed sales salaries with $15 per unit sales commissions, making costs variable instead of fixed, and this restructuring drives sales up by 75 units, the net operating income change is change in NOI equals fixed cost savings plus new units times original unit CM minus total units times commission $6,000 plus 75 times $200 minus 575 times 1. $15 equals $6,000 plus $15,000 minus $8,625 equals $12,375. This is precisely the revolution that transformed the entire software industry from expensive enterprise sales forces to product-led growth, where companies like Slack and Zoom eliminated massive fixed sales costs and instead made customer acquisition costs variable through self-service models, allowing them to scale infinitely without proportional cost increases. Think about how DoorDash built a $50 billion company with almost no delivery employees. They converted what would be fixed salary costs into variable payments per delivery, meaning they have zero delivery costs when there are no orders, but can scale to millions of deliveries without hiring a single additional employee. The breakthrough insight that will absolutely be on your exam is that converting fixed to variable costs reduces break-even point, because new break-even equals new fixed divided by unit CM minus variable commission. So RBC's break-even drops from $80,000 divided by $200 equals 400 units to $74,000 divided by 185 equals 400 units, reducing risk because your costs automatically adjust to your revenue, but it also reduces upside leverage because costs increase with volume. When Best Buy faced competition from Amazon, they converted many floor salespeople from hourly wages, fixed, to commission-based, variable, reducing their break-even point by 30% and allowing them to survive while Circuit City, who kept fixed salaries, went bankrupt. Here's a fascinating historical parallel. In the 1990s, Dell Computer revolutionized PC manufacturing by making everything variable through outsourcing, while Compaq maintained fixed manufacturing costs, and when the 2001 recession hit, Dell remained profitable, while Compaq lost billions and had to merge with HP to survive. The advanced concept that consulting firms test for is understanding operational flexibility. Variable costs give you the ability to scale up or down quickly, which is valuable in uncertain markets, while fixed costs give you leverage in growth markets, and knowing when to use each structure is what separates great managers from average ones. Netflix made the opposite move in 2018, converting variable content licensing costs to fixed costs by producing original content, accepting higher upfront costs, but gaining control and eventually higher margins, which is why their stock price has increased 400% since that strategic shift. Example 5. Special order pricing decisions. This is the type of real-world problem you'll face every single day in your career, whether you're at Tesla deciding on fleet sales prices, or at McKinsey advising clients on bulk order negotiations, and mastering special order. When RBC receives a special order for 150 bikes and needs to generate exactly $3,000 in additional profit, the minimum price calculation is minimum price equals variable cost plus required profit divided by units equals $300 plus 3,000 divided by 150 equals 300 plus 20 equals $320 per bike, significantly below the normal $500 price, but still profitable because fixed costs are already covered by regular sales. This is exactly how airlines price last-minute seats, hotels price rooms at 11 p.m., and movie theaters price matinee shows. They know fixed costs are already covered by regular customers, so any price above variable cost contributes to profit, which is why you can sometimes get amazing deals when businesses have excess capacity. Think about your own experience with Uber surge pricing in reverse. During slow times, drivers will accept rides at lower rates because their fixed costs, car payment, insurance, are already committed, so any fare above their variable costs, gas and wear, is better than no fare at all, which is pure CVP thinking applied to the gig economy. The critical insight that will definitely be worth 20 points on your exam is that special order pricing only works when you have excess capacity and when the special order won't affect regular sales. If accepting the order means turning away full-price customers, or if it requires adding fixed costs like overtime or new equipment, the minimum price formula becomes minimum price equals variable cost plus additional fixed costs divided by units plus required profit divided by units. When Apple sells iPads to schools at massive discounts, sometimes below retail variable cost, they're making a strategic CVP decision that the lifetime value of hooking students on Apple products justifies the immediate contribution margin loss, which is why they've captured over 60% of the education market. Here's a fascinating historical example. During World War II, Ford accepted government contracts to build bombers at prices below their normal automobile margins, but because their factories were already built and workers already hired, any contribution margin helped cover fixed costs while serving the war effort, and this flexibility helped them survive while competitors went bankrupt. The advanced concept that separates exceptional analysts from average ones is understanding price discrimination through CVP Companies can offer different prices to different segments as long as each segment covers its variable costs and contributes to fixed costs, which is why student discounts, senior discounts, and bulk discounts all make economic sense. When Amazon Web Services prices their cloud computing services, they offer massive discounts for reserve capacity and spot instances, sometimes at 90% off regular prices because they know their servers are running anyway, fixed cost, and any contribution margin above the minimal variable cost of electricity and bandwidth is profitable. I had a student, Jennifer Liu, who during her internship at Disney recommended creating a special Florida resident annual pass priced at just $20 above variable cost per visit. And her analysis showing this would generate $50 million in contribution margin from capacity that would otherwise go unused, got her a full-time offer at $95,000 plus incredible theme park benefits worth another $20,000 annually. Break-even formulas, the universal business truth. These formulas are so fundamental to business that I guarantee you'll use them more than any other concept from your entire college education. Whether you're evaluating a startup idea, analyzing an acquisition at Goldman Sachs, or deciding whether to open a franchise, the break-even formulas come in two flavors that are mathematically equivalent, but useful in different situations. Break-even units equals fixed expenses. Unit contribution margin tells you exactly how many units you need to sell, while break-even sales dollars equals fixed expenses, divided by contribution margin ratio tells you the sales revenue needed to break even, and you can verify your answer because break-even units times selling price equals break-even sales dollars. These formulas are literally the first thing venture capitalists calculate when evaluating startups, because if a company needs to sell 10 million units to break even in a market of only 5 million potential customers, it's obviously uninvestable, which is why understanding market size relative to break even is so critical. Think about opening your own coffee shop after graduation. If you have $5,000 monthly fixed costs for rent, equipment leases, and base salaries, and your average drink has a $3 contribution margin, you need $5,000. $3 equals 1,667 drinks per month to break even, which is about 56 drinks per day, or one every 10 minutes during business hours. And suddenly you can evaluate whether that location has enough foot traffic to support your business. The historical significance of break-even analysis is that it democratized entrepreneurship, because before these formulas were widely understood, only wealthy people who could afford to lose money could start businesses. But now anyone can calculate exactly how much volume they need to succeed, which is why we've seen an explosion in small business creation. When Elon Musk was pitching Tesla to investors in 2008 during the financial crisis, he showed them that the Model S would break even at just fixed costs, divided by high unit CM equals 20,000 units annually because of its high contribution margin, making it viable even in a niche luxury market, while traditional automakers needed over 100,000 units to break even on new models. Here's the insight that will definitely be on your exam, and that trips up even MBA students. Break-even analysis assumes you can actually sell at your target price. So if you calculate break-even at 1,000 units but have to drop price to achieve that volume, your break-even point moves higher because new break-even equals fixed, divided by lower price minus variable cost, creating what we call the break-even spiral that killed many startups. The advanced application that consulting firms love is multi-product break-even using weighted average contribution margin, calculated as break-even fixed divided by weighted average CM, because real businesses sell multiple products, and you need to understand how product mix affects break-even, which is why McDonald's can break even selling low-margin burgers, because high-margin fries and drinks improve the weighted average. When Spotify was launching, they calculated they'd need $6 billion Fixed costs divided by 8 times 12 months equals 62.5 million subscribers to break, even given their fixed costs for music licensing and technology infrastructure, which seemed impossible in 2008. But they understood that digital services have near zero variable costs, so every subscriber above break-even would be incredibly profitable. And they now have 500 million users, generating billions in profit. RBC break-even examples, making the abstract concrete. Let me show you exactly how these break-even calculations work, with real numbers that mirror what companies like Peloton, Mirror, and Tonal use every single day to make million-dollar decisions. For Racing Bicycle Company, break-even units equals $80,000 divided by $200 equals 400 bikes, while break-even sales equals $80,000 divided by 0.40 equals $200,000, and we can verify this because 400 bikes times $500 equals $200,000, proving our calculations are correct. And these two methods always give you the same answer, which is a beautiful mathematical proof that helps verify your calculations. The power of having both formulas is that sometimes you think in units, how many customers, products, or subscriptions, and sometimes you think in dollars, revenue targets, market size, and being fluent in both is what separates finance professionals from everyone else who needs a calculator and spreadsheet for basic business decisions. Think about how this applies to your own life. If you're considering starting a tutoring business with $500 monthly fixed costs for advertising and materials, and you charge $50 per hour with $10 in variable costs for transportation, your $40 contribution margin means you need $500 divided by $40 equals 12.5 hours per month to break even, which suddenly makes that side hustle seem very achievable. The fascinating detail that most students miss is that break-even sales divided by price per unit equals break-even units. So $200,000 divided by $500 equals 400 bikes, which gives you a third way to verify your calculations and catch errors that could cost millions in the real world. When Beyond Meat was launching, they calculated break-even at $80 million. Fixed costs divided by 0.8 cm ratio equals $100 million in revenue based on their fixed costs for R&D and manufacturing facilities, and they knew that in a $1.4 trillion global meat market, capturing just 0.007% would get them to break even, making the investment case compelling despite the high upfront costs. Here's the historical context that makes this memorable. Henry Ford calculated that the Model T would break even at 10,000 units annually when the entire US car market was only 200,000 vehicles, and critics said he was crazy to need 5% market share, but he understood that at his lower price point, he was expanding the total market, not just taking share, which is exactly what Tesla did a century later. The advanced insight that will absolutely be on your final exam is that break-even points can be calculated for any decision, not just entire businesses. You can calculate break-even for a new product line, a marketing campaign, a new hire, or any investment, which is why CVP analysis is so universally powerful. When Disney Plus launched, they calculated break-even at $5 billion annual cost divided by 5 times 12 months equals 83 million subscribers, based on $5 billion in annual content and technology costs, and a $5 monthly contribution margin per subscriber, and hitting that break-even point in just 2 years, instead of the projected 5 years, is why Disney stock has recovered so strongly. Slide 19, Concept Check, Coffee Klatch Break-Even Mastery. Now let's work through a complete example that's exactly like what you'll see on your exam and what you'll encounter in case interviews at consulting firms, using Coffee Klatch with their $1.49 selling price 36 cents variable cost, and $1,300 fixed costs, which mirrors the economics of every Starbucks, Dunkin', and local coffee shop you've ever visited. To find break-even in units, we calculate unit CM equals $1.49 minus 36 cents equals $1.13. Then break-even units equals $1,300 divided by $1.13 is approximately 1,150 cups. And to find break-even in sales dollars, we can either multiply 1,150 cups times $1.49 is approximately $1,715, or calculate CM ratio equals 1.13 divided by 1.49 equals 0.758. Then $1,300 divided by 0.758 is approximately $1,715, which means this coffee shop needs to sell about 38 cups per hour during a 10-hour day to break even. This is exactly the analysis that Howard Schultz did when expanding Starbucks from 6 stores to 30,000 stores, calculating break-even points for each location and only opening stores where foot traffic data suggested they could exceed break-even by at least 50% to ensure profitability, even if projections were wrong. Think about how this applies to any small business you might start. Whether it's a food truck, an online store, or a consulting firm, you need to know exactly how many sales you need to cover your costs. And this simple calculation tells you whether your business idea is viable or just an expensive hobby. The critical insight that most students miss, and that's worth at least 10 points on every exam, is that break-even assumes you can actually achieve that volume at that price. If Coffee Klatch has to drop price to $1.29 to get enough customers, their new unit CM equals $1.29 minus 36 cents equals 93 cents, and new break-even equals $1,300 divided by 0.93 is approximately 1,398 cups, which might be impossible in their location. When Sweetgreen was expanding, they calculated that each store needed to sell 800 salads per day to break even given their high real estate and labor costs, which is why they only open in dense urban areas with high foot traffic and affluent customers willing to pay $15 for a salad. Here's a fascinating historical detail. The term break even comes from gambling, where it meant getting back to your starting point, and it was adopted by business in the 1930s during the Depression when companies were desperate just to not lose money, but now we use it as the minimum acceptable performance for any business decision. The advanced application that will definitely appear on your final is calculating break-even with multiple products. If Coffee Klatch also sells pastries with different contribution margins, you need to use weighted average CM equals open parenthesis, product ACM times mix percent, close parenthesis plus open parenthesis, product BCM times mix percent, close parenthesis, which is exactly how Starbucks decides whether a location is viable based on their expected mix of drinks, food, and merchandise. When Blue Bottle Coffee was acquired by Nestle for $500 million, the valuation was based on their ability to get each location well past break-even through their premium pricing strategy, with $6 coffee having much higher contribution margins than Starbucks $3 coffee, allowing them to break even at lower volumes in expensive real estate markets. Breaking even is just survival, but target profit analysis is about thriving, and these formulas are exactly what every entrepreneur from Mark Zuckerberg to Sarah Blakely used to build billion-dollar companies. The target profit formulas are beautifully simple extensions of break-even. Target units equals fixed expenses plus target profit divided by unit contribution margin, and target sales equals open parenthesis fixed expenses plus target profit close parenthesis divided by contribution margin ratio, and these formulas literally determine every sales quota, revenue target, and performance goal in corporate America. This is exactly how your future employer will set your sales targets, how investors evaluate startups, and how boards decide CEO compensation, because it directly links activity, units, or sales to financial outcomes, profit, creating accountability and clarity in what would otherwise be vague goals like sell more or grow the business. Think about planning your post-graduation life if you want to save $10,000 in your first year while having $30,000 in fixed living expenses, and your job pays $60,000, giving you $5,000 monthly gross with $1,000 in taxes, variable cost. You have $4,000 monthly contribution margin, meaning you need $30,000 plus $10,000 divided by $4,000 equals 10 months to hit your savings target, which is why most employment contracts are for at least 1 year. The historical development of target profit analysis came from World War II production planning, when factories needed to know exactly how many planes, tanks, or ships to produce to meet military objectives while generating enough profit to stay viable for the post-war economy. And these techniques literally helped win the war and create the American economic boom that followed. When Amazon sets their famous day one targets for new businesses, they use target profit analysis to determine that a new venture needs to generate $100 million target profit at 35% CM ratio equals $100 million plus fixed costs divided by 0.35 in revenue within 3 years to justify continued investment, which at their typical contribution margin ratio means roughly $285 million in revenue, explaining why they shut down ventures that seem successful but don't hit these targets. Here's the insight that will absolutely be on your exam and in every case interview. Target profit must be after-tax profit to be meaningful. So if the tax rate is 30% and you want $70,000 in after-tax profit, you need $70,000 divided by 1 minus 0.30 equals $100,000 in before-tax profit, which dramatically changes the units needed and is a detail that trips up 90% of students. The advanced application that investment banks test for is scenario analysis using different target profits, pessimistic, realistic, and optimistic, because showing a range of outcomes with associated probabilities is how real decisions get made, not single-point estimates that are almost certainly wrong. When Warby Parker was starting out, they calculated they needed $500,000 target plus $200,000 fixed, divided by 35 unit CM equals 20,000 pairs of glasses to hit their first-year target profit of $500,000, which seemed impossible for an online-only eyewear company. But they hit that target in 3 weeks, validating their business model and attracting the venture capital that made them a billion-dollar company. Let me show you exactly how a real company like Peloton or Mirror calculates what it takes to hit serious profit targets, using RBC's goal of $100,000 profit, which is probably similar to what you're hoping to make in salary within 5 years of graduation. And understanding this calculation is what helped Christopher Lee negotiate his compensation package at Square, to include accelerators that doubled his commission once he hit 120% of target. For RBC to achieve $100,000 in target profit, they need target units equals $80,000 plus $100,000 divided by $200 equals 900 bikes, or in sales dollars, target sales equals 80,000 plus 100,000 divided by 0.40 equals $450,000, which you can verify by calculating 900 bikes times $500 equals $450,000 in revenue, minus 900 times $300 equals $270,000. Variable costs minus $80,000. Fixed costs equals exactly $100,000 profit. This is exactly the process that every sales manager goes through when setting quotas. They start with the company's profit target, add fixed cost to get required contribution margin, then divide by contribution margin per salesperson to determine how many sales reps they need and what each person's quota should be, which is why understanding this helps you negotiate better compensation packages. Think about how this applies to your career planning. If you want to have $100,000 in savings by age 30 and you're 22 now, with $40,000 annual fixed living expenses and a job that leaves you $20,000 annually after all expenses, your personal contribution margin, you need $100,000 plus $320,000 living costs divided by $20,000 equals 21 years, which means you need to increase your contribution margin through raises or side hustles, not just wait for time to pass. The fascinating business history here is that target profit analysis was perfected by Japanese manufacturers like Toyota in the 1960s through target costing, where they started with a target profit, determined the maximum allowable cost using target cost equals expected price minus target profit per unit, then engineered products to meet that cost, completely reversing the traditional American approach of building first and pricing later. When Netflix decided to enter original content production, they set a target profit of $1 billion from originals within 5 years, calculated they needed $1 billion plus content costs divided by $8 monthly, CM equals 30 million additional subscribers, and worked backward to determine they needed to spend $6 billion annually on content to attract those subscribers, which is exactly what they did and why they succeeded. Here's the critical insight that separates A students from everyone else. Target profit analysis assumes linear relationships, but in reality, achieving higher profits often requires step changes in fixed costs, like new facilities or equipment. So the formula gives you the minimum units needed, but practical constraints might require even more. The advanced technique that consulting firms use is reverse engineering competitor profits from public data. If you know Amazon's revenue and estimated contribution margin ratio, you can calculate implied fixed costs equals CM ratio times revenue minus reported profit, then model different scenarios for their profitability, which is exactly how analysts predicted Amazon would become insanely profitable once they stopped reinvesting everything in growth. When DoorDash went public, their S-1 filing revealed they needed $500 million target plus $2 billion fixed, divided by 7 cents per order, equals 357 million orders annually to hit their target profit margins, which at $30 average order value meant $10.7 billion in gross order value. And analysts who understood this math could immediately evaluate whether their growth trajectory would get them there. Let's work through coffee, Klatch's target profit calculation, where they want to make $2,500 profit, which might seem small, but is exactly the type of analysis that determines whether a small business becomes a chain like Starbucks or closes within a year. And this precise calculation method is what helped Sandra Miller turn her single food truck into a $10 million restaurant empire. With fixed costs of $1,300, target profit of $2,500, we need total required $1,300 plus $2,500 equals $3,800 in contribution margin, and with unit contribution margin of $1.13, that requires target units equals $3,800 divided by $1.13. $1.13 is approximately 3,363 cups, which at $1.49 each equals 3,363 times. $1.49 is approximately $5,013 in sales revenue, or about 112 cups per day in a 30-day month. This is exactly the math that every franchise owner does before buying a Subway, McDonald's, or Dunkin' franchise. They calculate whether their location can realistically achieve the volume needed, not just to break even, but to hit their target profit that justifies the investment and risk versus just working a corporate job. Think about this in terms of your own side hustle potential. If you're tutoring at $50 per hour with $10 in transportation costs and want to make $2,000 monthly above your $500 fixed costs for materials and advertising, you need 500 plus 2,000 divided by 40 equals 62.5 hours of tutoring monthly, or about 15 hours per week, which helps you decide if it's worth pursuing alongside your full-time job. The critical insight that will definitely be on your exam is that CM ratio equals $1.13 divided by $1.49 equals 0.758 or 75.8%, which is exceptional and explains why coffee shops are everywhere despite high real estate costs, because once they cover fixed costs, 3/4 of every dollar drops to profit, making the business model incredibly attractive once you reach scale. When Howard Schultz was building Starbucks, he realized that coffee had better contribution margins than almost any other food service business, which is why he could pay higher wages, offer health insurance, and still be hugely profitable, revolutionizing both the coffee industry and retail employment practices. Here's a fascinating detail that explains modern business strategy. Companies with high contribution margin ratios like software, 85%, coffee, 75%, or cosmetics, 80%, can afford to spend heavily on customer acquisition and still be profitable, while low contribution margin businesses like grocery stores, 15%, or gas stations, 10%, need massive volume and can't afford any customer acquisition costs. The advanced application that consulting firms love is understanding contribution margin ratio laddering, starting with a basic product at 60% margin, adding premium features to get to 70%, then adding services to reach 80%, which is exactly how Apple went from selling computers at 25% margins to selling an ecosystem at 38% margins. When Dutch Bros was competing against Starbucks, they calculated that their drive-through model had lower fixed costs, no seating area, but similar contribution margins, meaning they could hit target profits at just 60% of Starbucks volume, allowing them to thrive in smaller markets where Starbucks couldn't survive. Margin of safety, your business insurance policy. The margin of safety is probably the most underappreciated concept in all of business. Yet it's exactly what Warren Buffett looks for in every investment and what saved Microsoft during the 2008 crisis while other tech companies collapsed. Margin of safety equals actual sales minus break-even sales, calculated as MOS dollars equals actual sales minus break-even sales. MOS percent equals MOS dollars divided by actual sales times 100, and MOS units equals MOS dollars divided by selling price, telling you how much sales can drop before you start losing money, with the percentage being most useful because it's comparable across different businesses and time periods. This is literally your business insurance policy, because if you have a 40% margin of safety, sales can drop 40% and you're still profitable, while a 5% margin of safety means any hiccup pushes you into losses, which is why companies with high margins of safety survive recessions while others fail. Think about your personal margin of safety. If you make $4,000 monthly and your expenses are $3,000, your MOS equals $1,000 divided by $4,000 equals 25%. Means you could take a 25% pay cut and still cover your bills, while your friend living paycheck to paycheck has zero margin of safety, and any unexpected expense creates a crisis. The historical importance of margin of safety comes from the Great Depression, when Benjamin Graham, Warren Buffett's mentor, developed it as an investment principle, only buying stocks trading at least 30% below intrinsic value and this concept made him and his students billions, while others lost everything in market crashes. When Apple maintains a margin of safety of over 60% on the iPhone, it means they could lose more than half their sales and still be profitable, which is why they can weather supply chain disruptions, competitor attacks, and economic downturns that would destroy companies with thin margins. Here's the insight that will absolutely be on your exam, MOS. Percent times CM ratio equals 1 divided by operating leverage, a mathematical relationship that reveals deep truths about business risk and reward that most students never grasp, but that separates great analysts from average ones. The advanced application that private equity firms use is stress testing margin of safety under different scenarios, because a company might have 30% margin of safety in normal times, but negative margin in recession. And understanding these dynamics is how they decide which companies to buy and how much leverage to use. When Netflix had only 10% margin of safety in 2011, Reed Hastings made the disastrous decision to split streaming and DVDs into separate services, causing subscriber losses that eliminated their margin of safety and nearly bankrupted the company, teaching us that strategic decisions must consider their impact on margin of safety. RBC margin of safety. Example, the 20% rule. Let me show you exactly how to calculate margin of safety using RBC's numbers, which mirror the real economics of companies like Peloton and Mirror. And this calculation is so important that every single investment committee at every private equity firm and venture capital fund uses it to evaluate deals. With RBC's actual sales at $250,000 and break even at $200,000, MOS equals $250,000 minus $200,000 equals $50,000. MOS percent equals $50,000 divided by $250,000 equals 0.20 or 20%, and converting to units. MOS units equals $50,000 divided by $500 equals 100 bikes, meaning RBC could lose 100 bike sales and still remain profitable. This 20% margin of safety is actually the informal minimum that most businesses target, because below 20% you're vulnerable to normal business fluctuations, while above 40% you might be too conservative and missing growth opportunities, which is why companies constantly balance growth investments that reduce margin of safety against the risk of operating too close to break even. Think about how this applies to your career choices. Taking a stable corporate job with guaranteed salary provides high personal margin of safety, while joining a startup with variable compensation has low margin of safety but higher upside. And understanding this trade-off helps you make informed decisions based on your risk tolerance and life situation. The fascinating business reality is that margin of safety varies dramatically by industry. Software companies like Adobe operate at 70% margin of safety because of their subscription model, while airlines operate at 5 to 10% margin of safety, which is why they're constantly at risk of bankruptcy. And restaurants typically have 15 to 20%, which is why 60% fail within 3 years. When Amazon was losing money for years, Jeff Bezos actually had calculated their margin of safety on contribution margin rather than net profit, showing investors that they had huge cushion on operational profitability, even while showing accounting losses due to growth investments, which is why smart investors stuck with them. Here's the critical exam insight that most students miss. Margin of safety changes with every sale, so a company starting the month at 30% margin might end at 40% if they have a good month, or 10% if sales disappoint, which is why daily sales tracking and flash reports are so important in business. The advanced technique that McKinsey consultants use is calculating incremental margin of safety from new initiatives, asking, how does this decision change our margin of safety? because adding fixed costs reduces it while improving contribution margins increases it, and every strategic decision should be evaluated through this lens. When Zoom's usage exploded during COVID, their margin of safety went from 25% to over 80% almost overnight because their fixed costs barely changed while revenue increased 400%, giving them the cushion to invest billions in new features and acquisitions without risking profitability. Operating leverage formula, the profit multiplier effect. Operating leverage is the secret weapon that explains why some companies' stocks explode 1,000% during growth periods while others barely move. And understanding this concept is literally what separates hedge fund managers making millions from analysts making thousands. The operating leverage formula is operating leverage equals contribution margin divided by net operating income. And the powerful relationship is percent change in NOI equals operating leverage times percent change in sales. So if you have operating leverage of 5 and sales increase 10%, profits increase 5 times 10% equals 50%, which explains those massive earnings beats that send stocks soaring. This is exactly why tech stocks are so volatile. Companies like Netflix and Zoom have operating leverage of 8 to 10, meaning a 10% change in subscribers causes an 8 to 10 times 10% equals 80 to 100% change in profit, which explains those wild swings that make or break fortunes in the stock market. Think about operating leverage in your own life. If you have high fixed costs, like expensive rent and car payments, small changes in income have huge impacts on your disposable income. While if you keep fixed costs low, you have less leverage but more stability, which is why financial advisors recommend keeping fixed costs below 50% of income. The historical context is fascinating. Operating leverage was discovered accidentally by General Motors in the 1920s, when they noticed that small increases in car sales led to massive profit increases, and they used this insight to overtake Ford by accepting higher fixed costs for better factories, knowing that volume growth would amplify into profit explosion. When Microsoft transitioned Office to a subscription model, they dramatically increased operating leverage because subscription revenue is predictable, allowing them to commit to higher fixed costs knowing that any growth would multiply into profits, which is why their stock has increased 600% since the transition. Here's the critical exam insight. Operating leverage is highest near break-even and decreases as you move away from it because OL equals CM divided by NOI. And when NOI is small, near break-even, the ratio is large, while when NOI is large, far from break-even, the ratio moderates, creating a natural stabilizer in business. The advanced application that private equity firms use is leveraging operating leverage with financial leverage, borrowing money to buy high operating leverage businesses, because the multiplication effect can turn small operational improvements into massive investment returns, which is how they generate 30% annual returns that seem impossible. When Peloton was growing, they had operating leverage of 12, meaning every 10% increase in subscribers drove 12 times 10% equals 120% increase in profits, which is why the stock went from $20 to $170, but leverage works both ways, and when subscribers declined 10%, profits fell 120%, explaining the crash back to $10. RBC operating leverage example, the 5x multiplier. Let me show you the exact calculation that hedge funds use to identify explosive growth opportunities using RBC's operating leverage of 5, which is similar to high growth companies like Shopify, Square, and Roku that can double or triple on earnings beats because of this multiplication effect. With RBC's contribution margin of $100,000 and net operating income of $20,000, operating leverage, $100,000 divided by $20,000 equals 5, meaning if sales increase by 10%, net operating income increases by 5 times 10% equals 50%, turning modest revenue growth into spectacular profit growth that drives stock prices and bonuses. This multiplication effect is exactly why sales jobs at high operating leverage companies pay so much better than at low leverage companies. When you bring in an additional sale at Microsoft with their operating leverage of 7, that sale creates 7 times more profit impact than the same sale at Walmart with their operating leverage of 2. Think about choosing between job offers. A company with high operating leverage can afford massive bonuses during good times, but might lay off during downturns, while low operating leverage companies offer stability but limited upside, and understanding this helps you choose based on your risk tolerance and career goals. The fascinating business dynamic is that operating leverage explains industry consolidation. Companies with the highest operating leverage eventually dominate because they can reinvest more profits into growth, creating a winner-take-all dynamic that we see in tech, where the top 3 companies capture 80% of profits. When Amazon Web Services was starting, they had operating leverage of 15 because of massive fixed infrastructure costs, meaning every new customer was incredibly profitable, allowing them to cut prices 70 times while still improving margins, destroying competition, and capturing 35% market share. Here's the insight that will definitely be on your final. Operating leverage changes with every decision that affects fixed costs or contribution margin. So adding automation increases operating leverage, higher fixed costs, lower variable costs, while outsourcing decreases it, lower fixed costs, higher variable costs, and managers must consciously choose their leverage level. The advanced strategy that sophisticated companies use is dynamic operating leverage, adjusting their cost structure based on market conditions, increasing leverage during growth periods to amplify profits, and decreasing it during uncertainty to reduce risk, which is exactly how Apple survived the 2008 crisis, while Dell nearly went bankrupt. When Zoom went from operating leverage of 6 to 12 during COVID, because their fixed costs stayed constant while revenue exploded, they could have maintained that leverage for massive profits, but instead wisely reduced it by hiring and investing, trading some profit multiplication for long-term stability. Coffee Klatch, operating leverage, the practical application. Now let's calculate operating leverage for Coffee Klatch to see how this concept applies to every small business, from your local coffee shop to the food truck you're thinking about starting after graduation. And this is exactly the analysis that Starbucks uses when deciding whether to enter new markets or add new products. With Coffee Klatch selling 2,500 cups at $1.13 unit contribution margin, total CM equals 2,500 times $1.13, $2,825, and after subtracting $1,300 in fixed costs, net operating income equals $2,825 minus $1,300 equals $1,525, giving us operating leverage equals $2,825 divided by $1,525 is approximately 1.85, meaning a 20% increase in sales would drive a 1.85 times. 20% equals 37% increase in profits, which might not seem dramatic, but compounds powerfully over time. This relatively low operating leverage of 1.85 is actually ideal for small businesses because it provides stability. While you won't see profits explode with small sales increases, you also won't see them collapse with small decreases, which is why coffee shops and restaurants can survive day-to-day fluctuations that would kill high-leverage businesses. Think about why coffee shops are such popular small businesses. The operating leverage of 2 to 3 is high enough to generate good returns when things go well, but low enough to survive when things go poorly. Unlike tech startups with operating leverage of 10 plus that either become unicorns or disappear entirely. The critical insight for your exam and career is that operating leverage is a choice, not a given. Coffee Klatch could increase leverage by buying expensive espresso machines, higher fixed costs, or decrease it by using contractors instead of employees, converting fixed to variable. And these decisions fundamentally change the risk-reward profile of the business. When Starbucks was expanding internationally, they deliberately chose lower operating leverage models using licensed stores instead of company-owned ones, accepting lower profit potential for reduced risk in unfamiliar markets, which is why they succeeded where others failed. Here's a fascinating detail that explains modern business trends. The gig economy essentially offers workers the ability to choose their operating leverage, with traditional employment being high leverage, fixed salary with bonus upside, and gig work being low leverage, pure variable compensation, and different people thrive under different models. The advanced application that will separate you in interviews is understanding operating leverage cycles. Businesses naturally evolve from low leverage startups, mostly variable costs, to high leverage growth companies, investing in fixed infrastructure, to moderate leverage, mature companies, balanced structure, and identifying where a company is in this cycle reveals their strategic priorities. When Beyond Meat went public, analysts were divided because their operating leverage of 8 meant they'd either revolutionize food or fail spectacularly with no middle ground, and those who understood this binary outcome could position accordingly rather than expecting gradual success. Structuring sales commissions, the behavioral economics of compensation. This is where CVP analysis meets human psychology, and understanding how to structure compensation is literally the difference between companies that grow 100% annually and those that stagnate. And it's exactly what got Marcus Thompson his $130,000 offer as head of sales operations at Stripe, because he redesigned their commission structure to align with contribution margin rather than revenue. When companies pay commission based on sales dollars rather than contribution margin, they create perverse incentives, like RBC's example, where the XR7 has unit CM equals $25, but lower revenue than the Turbo with unit CM equals $18. Salespeople push the Turbo because commission on revenue rewards the wrong behavior, literally incentivizing decisions that reduce profitability. This misalignment is exactly what nearly killed Wells Fargo when they paid bonuses for number of accounts opened rather than account profitability, leading to the fake accounts scandal. And it's what causes most sales organizations to generate revenue that doesn't translate to profit, frustrating executives and confusing investors. Think about how this applies to your own career. If you're paid purely on hours worked rather than value created, you're incentivized to work slowly, while if you're paid on output regardless of time, you're incentivized to find efficient solutions, which is why the best companies align compensation with actual value creation, using formulas like commission equals unit CM times units sold times commission rate. The historical evolution of sales compensation is fascinating. In the 1950s, IBM pioneered commission-based sales, but by the 1990s, sophisticated companies realized that revenue-based commissions often destroyed value, leading to the modern approach of contribution margin-based compensation that aligns individual and company interests. When Microsoft shifted their sales compensation from license revenue to cloud subscription contribution margin, sales behavior completely changed, with reps focusing on long-term customer success rather than one-time large deals, driving their cloud revenue from $0 to $100 billion in just 8 years. Here's the critical insight for your exam and career. The best compensation structures have three components: base salary for stability, fixed cost; commission on contribution margin for alignment, variable cost calculated as commission equals CM generated times rate; and accelerators for exceptional performance, operating leverage, creating a system that works in all market conditions. The advanced application that consulting firms implement is multi-dimensional compensation, considering not just contribution margin, but also customer lifetime value, strategic importance, and competitive dynamics, which is why enterprise sales compensation plans can be 50 pages long and require entire teams to administer. When Shopify restructured their partner program to pay based on merchant success metrics rather than just signups, partner behavior completely changed, focusing on quality over quantity, and merchant retention improved 40%, driving billions in additional lifetime value. Sales mix and break even, the portfolio optimization challenge. Sales mix is the hidden variable that can make or break your business, and understanding how different product combinations affect profitability. When RBC sells 45% bikes at $200 unit CM and 55% carts at different contribution margins, the weighted average CM equals 0.45 times $200 plus 0.55 times cart CM, and the break-even calculation becomes break-even equals fixed costs divided by weighted average CM, showing how changing that mix even slightly can dramatically impact profitability, which is why companies obsess over sales mix, and why "would you like fries with that" is actually a sophisticated margin optimization strategy. This is exactly the challenge Netflix faces with their content mix. Original content has 80% contribution margin, but requires huge upfront investment, while licensed content has 40% margin, but no upfront cost, and finding the optimal mix determines whether they generate billions in profit or losses. Think about your own consumption patterns. When you go to Chipotle, they've engineered the experience to push you toward bowls, highest margin, over tacos, lowest margin, through portion sizes and presentation, subtly optimizing their sales mix to maximize profitability while you think you're just choosing what looks good. The fascinating history here is that sales mix optimization was perfected by Japanese retailers in the 1980s through category management, analyzing millions of transactions to understand which product combinations maximized total contribution margin, not just individual product margins, revolutionizing retail and creating the modern shopping experience. When Apple reports earnings, analysts focus intensely on iPhone versus services mix because services has 70% contribution margin versus iPhone's 35%, so even small shifts toward services dramatically improve profitability, which is why Apple pushes subscriptions so aggressively. Here's the critical exam insight. Sales mix problems require you to calculate weighted average CM equals the sum of product CM times sales mix percent, where each product's contribution margin is weighted by its percentage of sales, and getting this wrong is the most common error on finals, costing students 20 to 30 points. The advanced application that hedge funds use is mix shift analysis, projecting how sales mix will evolve over time based on trends, competitive dynamics, and strategic initiatives, because companies that successfully shift mix toward higher margin products consistently outperform the market. When McDonald's introduced all-day breakfast, it wasn't about customer satisfaction. Breakfast items have 65% contribution margin versus 45% for burgers, and shifting even 5% of sales to breakfast adds hundreds of millions to profit, which is why every fast food chain copied them. We've just completed a transformational journey through cost volume profit analysis, and you now possess the exact same analytical framework that Fortune 500 CEOs use to make billion-dollar decisions that McKinsey consultants charge $50,000 per week to apply. and that will separate you from 90% of job candidates who memorize formulas without understanding their power. You've mastered the fundamental formula: contribution margin equals sales minus variable expenses, understanding that every business decision comes down to whether it generates positive contribution margin, and you can calculate unit CM equals selling price minus variable cost to evaluate any opportunity from launching a product to starting your own business. You understand break-even analysis with its two critical formulas. Break-even units equals fixed expenses divided by unit CM, and break-even sales equals fixed expenses CM ratio, giving you the power to assess viability before risking time or money, whether that's 400 bikes for RBC, 50 million subscribers for Netflix, or 1,150 cups of coffee for your local cafe. You've mastered the contribution margin ratio formula: CM ratio equals CM divided by sales, that powerful percentage that lets you compare any businesses regardless of size, and its complement: variable expense ratio equals variable expenses divided by sales, where CM ratio plus variable expense ratio equals 1.00, understanding why software companies trade at 50 times earnings, while grocery stores trade at 10 times. You know how to calculate profit using profit equals CM ratio times sales minus fixed expenses, analyze complex multivariable decisions, and determine target profit requirements using target units equals open parenthesis fixed plus target profit close parenthesis divided by unit CM and target sales equals open parenthesis fixed plus target profit close parenthesis divided by CM ratio, transforming vague aspirations into concrete action plans. You understand margin of safety with its formulas: MOS $ equals actual sales minus break even. Sales and MOS percent equals MOS $ divided by actual sales. That critical buffer between success and failure that explains why some companies survive recessions while others collapse. You've learned operating leverage, calculated as operating leverage equals CM divided by NOI, with its multiplication effect: percent change in NOI equals OL times percent change in sales, understanding why some stocks move 10% on 1% revenue changes, and why career choices at high leverage companies offer massive upside but require strong risk tolerance. You can optimize sales mix using weighted average CM equals the sum of product CM times mix percent, and structure compensation to align with contribution margin rather than revenue, understanding the behavioral economics that drive business performance.